Welcome to the Poseidon Finance channel. Do me a favor and hit the like and subscribe button. Let's get started. The sign-off is what gives it away. Have fun and enjoy. 3 words on a truth. Social post, posted Friday afternoon, May 8th. That is the President of the United States announcing the release of roughly 160 declassified documents on what the government now calls unidentified anomalous phenomena. Not, we have located non-human intelligence. Not, the truth is finally being revealed. Have fun and enjoy. Sit with that for a second. Sit with the specific tonal register of those 3 words. Because the entire story you need to understand about what just happened lives in that sign-off and not in any of the documents themselves. I'm going to tell you something that is probably going to bother some of you. The release that happened on May 8th. It has very little to do with aliens. It has very little to do with national security in the conventional sense. What it actually is, and this is the argument I am going to defend over the next hour, what it actually is a public confession from the United States government that there exists, inside the security apparatus, a category of information that the apparatus itself cannot resolve. And that category has been growing since roughly 1947, give or take. Now, some of you are looking at me skeptically. Good, you should. I told a former student of mine this thesis on the phone 2 days ago. He runs a desk at, let's just say he runs a desk in Midtown. And he said, "You sound like one of those guys." I get it. So let me earn the argument. The release was about 160 files, photos, infrared sensor footage, transcripts from the Apollo 12 and Apollo 17 missions, FBI eyewitness records spanning 1947 through 1968, and a number of recent military reports from Iraq, Syria, the United Arab Emirates, Greece, and the Western United States. The website hosting all of this is war.gov/UFO. We will come back to the URL choice. That is not a small thing. Here is the part nobody's reporting correctly. In the press release, the Director of National Intelligence said something to the effect of, "The American people can now make up their own minds." That sentence, "make up your own minds," is the entire operative event. Everything else is window dressing. Because what you are watching, when a government tells you to make up your own mind about its own classified data, is a very specific institutional move. It is not transparency, it is not deception, it is a third thing, and that third thing is what this lecture is about. I want you to think of it this way. Imagine you walked into the Federal Reserve and you asked the chair, "What is the inflation rate?" And the chair said, "Here are 47 million data points, you decide." That would not be transparency. That would be, on one level, it is the most transparent thing imaginable. They gave you all the inputs. But on another level, it is the opposite of transparency. Because what you actually wanted from the Fed was the analytical work, the interpretation of the price they were willing to put on the residual, right? So, what we are watching is the security state declining to interpret its own archive. And the question I want you to hold for the rest of this hour is, what does that decline mean? What does it expose about the architecture of how modern institutions handle information they cannot adjudicate? There is a concept I am going to introduce later, and I want to plant the seed now so it has time to grow. Every major operative system in modern life, and I mean this, every single one, insurance markets, capital markets, intelligence agencies, hospitals, courts, you name it, every one of them carries what I have started calling the unresolved residue, the bracket, the category of inputs that the system itself cannot resolve but cannot dispose of either. They sit there. They accumulate. They distort the system from inside without ever being formally counted. For about 300 years, certain markets have figured out how to price the bracket. We will spend an entire section on that, on Edward Lloyd's coffee house in 1688, on a group of marine underwriters who solved this problem long before the Pentagon ever encountered it. For about 80 years, since the late 1940s, the United States national security state has been accumulating its own bracket and refusing to acknowledge that the bracket exists at all. What happened on May 8th was the first time, in 80 years, that the security state put the bracket on a public website. Not because they wanted to. I do not believe that for a second. They did it because the bracket had grown so large, and the political pressure to address it had grown so concentrated, that releasing the inputs without conclusions became the lowest cost option for an institution that could no longer defend the closed posture. That is the real story. So if you stay with me for the next hour, here is what you are going to walk out understanding. You are going to understand why the release was structurally inevitable, given the pressures on the institution. You are going to understand what insurers have known since the 17th century about pricing the unknowable. You are going to understand why the geography of UFO sightings tells you almost nothing about UFOs and almost everything about American sensor architecture. You are going to understand why the people who actually move money, the desk guys, the catastrophe modelers, the reinsurers, looked at the May 8th release and recognized something most of the public missed. And you are going to understand, I hope, that this whole thing is not a UFO story. It is a story about how every system you operate inside, including the ones you yourself run, handles the things it cannot price. We are going to start with what is in the files, not what the headlines say is in the files, what is actually in there. So let me show you. The conventional read on the May 8th release breaks into 3 camps, and all 3 are wrong, and I want to explain why before we get to the right answer. Camp 1, aliens. The files prove the government has been hiding extraterrestrial contact for decades, and now they are starting to drip release the truth. This is what most YouTube comments under the release videos are saying. It is also what a chunk of the audience for this lecture probably half believes walking in. I'm not here to argue with anyone's metaphysics. I'm here to tell you that nothing in those files closes the gap between we have a sensor return we cannot explain, and this was not produced by humans or human-adjacent technology. Not one document does that work, not one image, not one transcript. Camp 2, deception. The government is fabricating sensor footage to create a distraction, or to test public reaction, or to lay groundwork for some psychological operation. This one I have a little more sympathy for because the security state has, in fact, run domestic perception campaigns before, and we can name them. But the specific accusation here does not survive contact with the documents. The infrared footage is consistent with the kind of returns that real aviators have been reporting for decades. The Apollo 12 and 17 transcripts are real. The FBI eyewitness records from 47 through 68 are real. You can tell because they read like the kind of clerical material a federal field office produces, and that is not a register that is easy to fake convincingly across hundreds of pages. Camp 3, transparency. The government has finally decided to stop hiding what it knows. President Trump should be commended for opening the archive. This one is actually closer to what a lot of cable news adopted as the framing on Friday night. And it is wrong in a more interesting way than the other 2. Because what was released was not what the government knows. What was released was what the government has been unable to figure out. The conclusions, if any conclusions exist, were not in the May 8th release. The unresolved cases were. So if all 3 of those camps are wrong, what is actually going on? And here we have to bring in a very old idea from a very specific economist named Frank Knight. Knight wrote a book in 1921 called Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit. It is one of the foundational texts of modern economics, and almost nobody outside of a graduate seminar has actually read it, including, let me confess, until I sat down with it for the second time roughly, I want to say it was the spring of 2004, give or take a year. I was teaching a class on financial economics for second-year doctoral students, and I picked the book up, assuming I knew what was in it, and I did not. What Knight did was draw a distinction between 2 things that we, in casual speech, conflate constantly. He distinguished between risk and uncertainty. Risk, in his framing, is the situation where you know the probability distribution. You can quantify it, you can price it. The classic example is a fair coin. You do not know which side will come up next, but you know exactly what the long-run frequency is. Insurance underwriters spend their lives working with risk in the Knightian sense. Mortality tables, hurricane frequencies in the Gulf, default probabilities on investment-grade corporate bonds. Risk. Uncertainty for Knight was something else entirely. Uncertainty is the situation where you do not even know the probability distribution. You cannot quantify it. You cannot price it directly because you do not know what game you are playing. The classic Knightian uncertainty would be, you are about to make a business decision in an industry that did not exist 5 years ago and may not exist 5 years from now. There is no historical base rate. The future is not a sample drawn from a known distribution. It is a sample drawn from a distribution that itself has to be guessed at. Now, the reason I am bringing Knight into this lecture is because the UAP residue that the Pentagon released on May 8th is, in the most precise technical sense, Knightian uncertainty. Not risk, not deception, uncertainty. The state has accumulated thousands of sensor returns over the last 80 years, and a fraction of those returns, call it the residue, cannot be assigned to a known distribution. Not because the state has not tried. The state has tried very hard. It established Project Sign in 47, Project Grudge in 49, Project Blue Book that ran from 52 to 69, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. Every one of these was an attempt to convert the residue into risk, into something quantifiable, priceable, manageable. Every one of them failed at that conversion in the same way. The residue did not shrink to 0. It refused to be converted. That is what is in those files. It is the residue from 80 years of failed conversion attempts. Now, why does this matter? It matters because the public conversation about the May 8th release is being conducted as if the question is, are these aliens or not? And that question is the wrong question. The right question is, what does it mean when a state apparatus that built itself around the implicit claim of asymmetric omniscience publicly admits that there exists a category of information it cannot adjudicate? That is a much harder question. It is also a much more useful question because the answer applies to every other domain in your professional life. Let me give you a concrete example so this does not stay abstract. Some of you are going to end up working in catastrophe reinsurance. Or you already do. When a reinsurer prices a Florida hurricane portfolio, they are working in pure Knightian risk. They have decades of frequency data, severity data, geographic distribution data. They can price it. When that same reinsurer is asked to price a portfolio of cyber attack exposures on critical infrastructure, and I mean the kind of attacks that happen at the level of nation-state actors, the kind of stuff we do not even have a public taxonomy for yet, they are working in Knightian uncertainty. There is no clean base rate. The actuaries have to invent the distribution as they go, and what they do in practice is they exclude. They write language into the policy that carves the unpriceable out. We will come back to that exclusion language in a few sections, because it tells you a great deal about what insurance has known for centuries that the security state is just now learning. For now, the move you need to register is this. The May 8th release is the security state quietly admitting that a portion of its archive is Knightian uncertainty rather than risk. That admission is unprecedented in the history of American intelligence. It is the foundation that just got pulled out from under the conventional reading. And what gets built on top of it next is the whole story of this lecture. I want to take you to London, 1688, give or take a couple of years. Tower Street, near the Thames. There is a coffee house run by a man named Edward Lloyd. The coffee is, by all accounts, mediocre. The coffee is not why people come. People come because Lloyd's Coffee House has become the unofficial information exchange for marine commerce in the City of London. Ship captains drink there, cargo merchants drink there, and a particular kind of man, who in those days did not have a formal name, drinks there. And his job is to sit at one of the tables, listen to the gossip about which ships are sailing where, and then write his name at the bottom of a piece of paper that says, "If your ship is destroyed on the way to the West Indies, I will pay you the value of your cargo, in exchange for which you will pay me a small fee up front." He underwrites, hence the term underwriter. Now, why am I taking you here? I am taking you here because the men in that coffee house faced exactly the same problem the United States Department of War faced last week, and they solved it 338 years earlier. Their problem was this. Ships were being lost. Cargo was disappearing. Sometimes the cause was identifiable. A known storm, a known pirate captain, a known reef. But a meaningful fraction of the losses came from causes nobody could name. Ships left port and never arrived. There was no wreckage. There were no witnesses. There was just the absence of the ship. Insurers needed to write contracts that covered these unnamed losses, but they could not enumerate the perils because, by definition, they did not know what the perils were. So they invented a phrase, perils of the sea. And that phrase, which is still in maritime contracts to this day, is one of the most sophisticated pieces of legal financial technology ever developed. Because what perils of the sea does is it names the residue without enumerating it. It says, there is a category of bad things that happen at sea. We cannot list them all, but we are willing to pay you if one of them happens to your ship. This is the move that the security state, on May 8th, did not quite have the institutional vocabulary to make. The Pentagon did not say, here are unresolved sensor returns, classified under a residual category of perils of the sky, paid out as Knightian uncertainty within the national security envelope. They said, instead, decide for yourself. Same problem, different solution. Lloyd's solved it in 1688. The Pentagon, 80 years into its own residue accumulation, still does not have a clean institutional name for the bracket. I want to say something here that Actually, no, let me back up first. Let me put one more piece of historical context on the table before I make the larger point. The American national security apparatus began its modern relationship with sensor anomalies in 1947. That is the year of the Roswell incident, but more importantly, it is the year the United States Air Force established Project Sign. Sign was the first formal program tasked with collecting and analyzing reports of unidentified flying objects. It ran for about a year and a half. It was succeeded by Project Grudge in 1949, which was succeeded by Project Blue Book in 1952, which ran for 17 years until it was officially closed in 1969. Blue Book reviewed something like 12,500 cases over its lifetime. About 700 of those, give or take, were classified as unexplained at the time of review. 700 cases, set in the residue, never resolved. The official position of the Air Force after Blue Book closed was, in essence, there is nothing here that threatens national security. The public should stop worrying about it, and we are no longer going to study it formally. That position held more or less until the early 2000s, when a series of internal Pentagon programs, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, AATIP, and the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program, AAWSAP, began quietly operating again. Both were eventually leaked. Both led to the establishment, in 2022, of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO, which was given a formal mandate to resolve anomalous sensor returns across the entire department. So you have this 80-year arc. The state is collecting a residue. The state is repeatedly trying to convert the residue into something it can adjudicate. The state is repeatedly failing at the conversion, and the residue grows. Now, here is the part where I am going to make a claim that I have not seen anyone in the popular coverage make, and you should push back on me hard if you disagree. The claim is this: the United States markets, specifically the marine and aviation insurance markets, which are the modern descendants of those Lloyd's Coffeehouse underwriters, have been quietly handling the same kind of residue on aviation and aerospace incidents since at least the 1950s, and they have been handling it more competently than the security state has. They handle it through exclusion language, through war risk endorsements, through perils of the air, carve-outs that mirror perils of the sea. The actuaries do not need the Pentagon to tell them what UAP are. They simply price around the residue and keep the books balanced. I want to mention a paper here. I am going to misstate the title, but it was something like, actually, let me just describe it. In the early 2000s, a group of catastrophe modelers at one of the big reinsurers, I believe it was Munich Re or possibly Swiss Re, did internal modeling work on what they called unattributed aerospace events. The work never went public, for what I assume are obvious commercial reasons. But a former colleague of mine who consulted for them at the time told me, over dinner in, must have been 2018, 2019, somewhere in there, he told me that the unattributed category was, in their internal modeling, treated as a Knightian residual with a small but non-zero standing allocation in their reserves. They priced the bracket, quietly, the way Lloyd's did in 1688. So when President Trump released the files on May 8th, what he was doing, whether he understood it or not, and I genuinely have no opinion on whether he did, was bringing the security state up to roughly the institutional sophistication that marine insurance had in the 17th century. That is the historical scale. That is how long the conceptual lag has been. And that lag is not unique to this issue. It is the recurring story of public sector institutions adopting techniques the private sector has been using for centuries. Now, we get to mechanism. How does this actually work, in operational terms, when an institution decides to release the bracket without releasing conclusions about the bracket? What does the choreography look like? Because the choreography is not accidental. It is, and I want to be careful not to overstate this, it is the product of a fairly mature playbook that gets used across a number of policy domains, and you can see the playbook clearly once you know what to look for. Let me walk you through the May 8th event in slow motion. February 2026, President Trump publicly directs Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and other officials to begin reviewing files related to alien and extraterrestrial life. The framing is populist. The framing is, the people deserve to know. April 26, Trump tells a conservative gathering that some, quote, very interesting documents will be released soon. The framing is teaser. The framing is, get ready. May 8th, the release happens, but the release is not what the framing implied. The release is 160 unresolved cases presented without analysis on a website branded under the newly renamed Department of War. Right. Stay with me. Each of those moves is doing specific work. The directive in February achieves what political scientists sometimes call legitimacy capture. By being the president who orders the release, Trump owns the credit for it, regardless of what the release contains. The teaser in April manages public expectations downward. By the time the actual files drop, the audience is primed for, quote, interesting documents, which is a deliberately elastic phrase that can describe almost anything. And the release itself, the May 8th event, has a structure that gives the institution 4 simultaneous benefits. Benefit 1, transparency credit. The administration can truthfully say, we released the files, no previous administration did this. We are the most transparent on this issue in American history. That statement is technically correct. It is also nearly content-free because the files released are the unresolved ones, not the ones the institution actually has views on. Benefit 2, no interpretive commitment. By saying, decide for yourself, the administration avoids stating what the files mean, which means it cannot be embarrassed later if a skeptic publicly explains away every case as drone footage and lens flare, and it cannot be embarrassed if a believer publicly explains every case as evidence of contact. The institution holds neither position. It has effectively privatized the interpretive labor while retaining its priors. Benefit 3, inoculation against future leaks. Once material is in the public domain, it cannot be leaked. The institution has preemptively deflated the value of any future whistleblower who tries to release the same files through unofficial channels. This is structurally a brilliant move, and it tells you something about the maturity of the playbook. Whoever advised this rollout understood how to denature future scandal. Benefit 4, channeling skeptic energy. The conspiratorial corner of the internet has spent 80 years demanding the files. Releasing them, even releasing only a portion of them, gives the conspiratorial energy somewhere to go. It moves the conversation from, what is the government hiding, to, look at this material the government finally let us see. That is a different conversation. It is, in political terms, a much more manageable conversation. Let me give you a non-UAP example so this does not feel like a one-off. In the late 1970s, the Federal Reserve under Arthur Burns was under intense political pressure for being insufficiently transparent about monetary policy decisions. The Fed responded, over a period of a few years. It was not all at once. by beginning to release portions of its meeting minutes, transcripts, and policy decisions on a delayed basis. Some of you are familiar with this transition. The Fed got transparency credit. Critics said, finally, we can see what they're doing. But the release was always lagged. The release always omitted the real-time deliberation. The release never included the unspoken consensus that forms in elevators and corridors. The Fed retained its priors. It captured transparency. And the political pressure subsided. Same playbook, different domain. Okay, I want to stay on May 8th for a minute longer because there's one more piece of choreography that I think is genuinely worth pausing on, and that is the URL choice. The release is hosted at war.gov/UFO, not defense.gov, war.gov. Earlier this year, the Department of Defense was rebranded to the Department of War. That rebrand is itself a substantive policy event that this lecture is not going to dwell on, but the implication for the May 8th release matters. Defense, as a category, implies a posture toward known threats. You defend against something specific. War, as a category, presumes a wider field of operations including the unknown. The semantic difference is small, the institutional implication is not. By branding the UAP release under the Department of War, rather than the Department of Defense, the administration is doing something fairly subtle. It is signaling that the unidentified is not necessarily a defensive concern, but a category of operations the state is broadly engaged with. That is a different epistemic posture than we have had on this issue since 1947. The Air Force under Project Blue Book treated UAP as a defensive question. Are these threats? Are they Soviet? Are they natural? The Department of War in 2026 is not asking that question. It is releasing the files into a much wider operational frame. A former student of mine, he is now at one of the Beltway think tanks, I will not name which one, he sent me a text the day of the release that I have been thinking about. He said, the URL is the policy. 3 words. The URL is the policy. What he meant was, the substance of the rebrand from defense to war, combined with the choice to use the war.gov domain for this release, is doing as much policy work as anything in the actual files. The medium is the message, and so on. I think he is right. I think the institutional researchers who study civil-military relations are going to be writing about that URL choice for the next decade. Most of the public will never notice it. So, to recap the surface mechanism, pressure builds over years. The administration releases inputs without conclusions. The institution captures 4 kinds of benefit simultaneously. The release is hosted on a freshly rebranded domain that itself encodes a policy shift. And the public is invited to make up its own mind, which sounds democratic, but is, in operational terms, a mode of institutional risk management. That is the surface layer. We have not gotten to the deep wiring yet. That is the next section. I am going to give you the framework now. I have been circling it for 4 sections. Here it is. The unresolved residue doctrine. Every operative system in modern life carries a category of inputs it cannot adjudicate. The system can either acknowledge the residue and price it openly, acknowledge it and bracket it explicitly, hide it and pretend to price it, or hide it and let it accumulate. Those are the 4 postures. And which posture an institution adopts tells you almost everything about how that institution will behave under stress. That is the doctrine. Now let me show you what it looks like when you apply it across domains, because the UAP release is a single instance of a much larger pattern, and once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Insurance. Marine and aviation insurers operate in posture 2. They acknowledge the residue and bracket it explicitly. The bracket is the war risk exclusion, the perils of the sea language, the perils of the air carve-out, the act of God clause. The Lloyd's market, 338 years on, still treats the bracket as a first-class object in the contract. It is named, it is reserved against, it is reinsured. This is the most mature posture available, and it is why insurance markets, despite being tedious, are quietly some of the most epistemically honest institutions in the modern economy. They had to be, because if they were not, they would fail. Capital markets, equity and credit markets operate, on a good day, in posture 3. They hide the residue and pretend to price it. Look at how the credit rating agencies handled mortgage-backed securities in 2007 and 2008. The residue, the structural correlation risk inside the collateralized debt obligations, was hidden inside risk models that pretended to price it. When the residue refused to stay hidden, the entire system failed in a few months. The 2008 crisis is, in this framing, a crisis of residue management. Posture 3 is dangerous. It is also extremely common in markets that face quarterly performance pressure because acknowledging residue costs short-term performance, geography and surveillance, the geography of UAP sightings. And this is one of the most important points in this lecture, so listen carefully. The geography of sightings tracks the geography of American sensor coverage. The recent files include incidents over Iraq, Syria, the United Arab Emirates, Greece, the Western United States, and various theaters of military operation. Those are not where the anomalies are. Those are where the apparatus is looking. If you put dense sensor arrays over the Sahel, you will get UAP reports from the Sahel. If you take them away, you will get fewer reports. The map of what we know is the map of where we have installed the means of knowing. Most policy debates about UAP are confusing observational density with phenomenal density. And that is a category error of the most basic kind, but it survives because the institutions that could correct it have no interest in correcting it. Surveillance institutions like to be seen as objective, artificial intelligence and data centers. The next phase of the UAP story, by misread, runs through compute. Releasing 160 files is a symbolic act. The unreleased corpus, decades of forward-looking infrared, multi-intelligence sensor logs, drone operator reports, is a corpus problem that only machine learning can metabolize at scale. Whoever holds the largest compute capacity with the right classifications gets first interpretive position. That favors a fairly small set of players: Palantir, Anduril, Scale, the hyperscalers running government cloud regions. Some of you in this room are going to work for those firms. The procurement category that did not exist 18 months ago, anomaly classification at intelligence scale, just became a real budget line. That is a venture capital signal. That is a federal grant signal. Watch for the new requests for proposals out of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Activity, the Air Force Research Laboratory. They are coming. Insurance again, but the modern version. Inland marine, ocean marine cargo, aviation hull and liability, satellite, war risk versus all risk policies. A formal federal acknowledgement of unresolved aerial anomalies creates real exposure questions. Lloyd's syndicates are going to need new exclusion language. The major specialty carriers, and I am thinking specifically about the aviation books at the big global writers, are going to need to update their reinsurance treaties. This will not happen in a press release. It will happen quietly, in renewal endorsements, over the next 12 to 24 months. The phrase, perils of the air of unknown origin, is about to start doing work it has not done since the 1930s. If you're in the specialty insurance space, you should already be thinking about this. Trade credit, supply chain, force majeure. Less direct, but worth flagging. Modern global supply chains have force majeure clauses that exist precisely to handle Knightian residue. Most of those clauses were written assuming a fairly conventional taxonomy of unforeseen events. A federal admission that a category of aerial events cannot be adjudicated does not directly trigger force majeure on most contracts, but it does shift the legal terrain on which future disputes will be litigated. The smart trade credit insurers and the smart supply chain attorneys are already updating language quietly. Quietly is the operative word. Politics and Congress. The May 8th release captures bipartisan credit because UAP scrambles the partisan vector. The President and the Senate Minority Leader found rare common ground on this issue. That is not because the issue is unifying. It is because the issue is outside the partisan coordinate system. UAP is one of those rare topics that does not map onto the left-right axis at all, which makes it, structurally, a pressure release valve. Use it for a political release when you cannot agree on anything else, and both parties get to claim credit. I expect, by the way, more such pressure release valves to appear in the next several years. The political system is finding fewer issues that work this way, and the ones that do are correspondingly valuable. So here's where we land. The unresolved residue doctrine says every major system carries a bracket. The UAP release is the United States security state moving from posture 4, hidden, accumulating, to a hybrid of posture 2 and posture 3, bracketed but not formally priced. That is a significant institutional event. It tells you something about the maturity of the apparatus. It also tells you something about which other institutions, in your own life, in your own sector, might be approaching the same transition. Think about your own employer. Whatever firm you are at or are going to, where is the residue in that firm? Where is the category of inputs that the firm cannot adjudicate but cannot dispose of? Maybe it is a class of customer complaints that nobody owns. Maybe it is a set of model validation failures that get repeatedly waved through. Maybe it is a portfolio of legacy contracts whose exposure cannot be modeled. Wherever it is, that is your bracket. That is your unresolved residue. And the question, the only question that really matters once you start thinking this way, is whether your firm is in posture 2, 3, or 4. Posture 2 firms survive shocks. Posture 3 firms get destroyed by them. Posture 4 firms, the ones still pretending the residue does not exist, they are the ones you do not want to be holding equity in when the convexity finally arrives. The Pentagon just moved out of posture 4. That is the real event, not the aliens, not the Apollo transcripts, not the infrared dots over the western United States. The event is the institutional shift. And once you see it that way, you start to notice every other institution making or not making the same shift. That is the asymmetric vision the people who manage real capital have been operating with for decades. It is not classified. It is not hidden. It is just outside the resolution most public discourse runs at. Have fun and enjoy. That was the sign-off. 3 words. Now you know what they meant.